Thanks for joining us for our third part on the authoritarianism series here at Into the Weeds. Today, we're going to start looking at current events and things that are happening right now and seeing if we can come up with a framework for whether or not to judge these things as authoritarian, whether or not we should be concerned about that with what this administration is doing at present. I know that one of the things that Phil wants to talk about are the January 6th pardons that Donald Trump just initiated. He blanket pardoned everybody. And Phil's got some facts on that he wants to go over. Let's start with that.
Okay, so that's a great place to start. So the first thing that we have to light, into the weeds, what we're doing is we're laying out the evidence and the details. So one of the things we have to talk about first, I think, is the pardoning power granted to the president by the Constitution. Um, the when the framers gave the president's power to pardon, it was pretty much an absolute power. And so, uh, no matter how you look at it, regardless of how anybody feels about Trump's pardons, Biden's pardons, Gerald Ford's pardons, that's clearly within the constitutional framework. Now, you could think that was a bad idea, right? The framers didn't anticipate what was going to happen. That's fine. But we have to sort of dispense with that idea that simply exercising pardon power by itself is a move towards authoritarianism, right? So I just want to get that out of the way. And Juba, I just want to make sure that we're on the same page there.
Yeah, and I think that's especially important in the context of the things that have happened very recently. And I think that we probably will end up being in agreement on both of the situations. We'll go over them in more detail, but the Bidens that took place at the tail end of the Biden administration were kind of questionable. A lot of people were scratching their heads about that. But then certainly also Trump coming out and blanket pardoning everybody that was involved in January 6th. Again, something we're going to talk about in more detail, but I think we're going to end up on the same page with that. But I agree that just the use of an authorized power is not authoritarian, right? So anybody who says pardoning people is an expression of authoritarianism, that's not correct. Let's get into more detail on the January 6th pardons and more that you had to say on that.
Right. Okay. So just like to summarize what happened, about 1,500 people were pardoned. 10 of them actually had sentences commuted. These were the members of the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys who were convicted of seditious conspiracy and some other things. So he didn't pardon them. What he did is he commuted their sentence and essentially said, "Time served. You're done." Now, there were 600 people, 608 people from the analysis that I saw were charged with actually assaulting law enforcement officers or obstructing law enforcement officers. 172 of those pleaded guilty to assaulting law enforcement officers. 69 pleaded guilty to assaulting law enforcement officers with a dangerous or deadly weapon. So people have completely different views. Jubal's one of them on how that we should deal with and should have dealt with um, the January 6th defendants. But I do think, for me at least, one of the things that I was concerned about had to do with specifically pardoning people who attacked law enforcement officers. That was huge to me. Um, I've watched, as everybody has, the videos of what happened on January 6th, and I'm always struck by a particular video where you can't actually see what's happening, but if you know about the story, what's happening is at one point the rioters had grabbed Michael Fanone and were literally dragging him down the steps. And at one point, they were stunning him with a stun gun. Uh, and at one point, somebody said, "Grab his gun and shoot him." Now, in fairness, some of the people in the crowd who were there outside the Capitol building eventually got around him and got him out of there. But for the people who were attacking law enforcement officers, to me, pardoning them is dangerous. And it's dangerous because of the message it sends. The message it sends is violence in service of, in this case, Donald Trump's violence in service of Donald Trump's um, political ends, which was essentially to overturn the presidential election is okay. And in the book that we're going to be talking about periodically through this series, one of the things that they identify, a pattern that they identify as sort of an indication of a movement in an authoritarian direction, is the person who is supposedly becoming authoritarian or may becoming authoritarian, are they allied with violent groups? Do they excuse or tolerate violence? And to me, this was a case where the message, in my view, was clear to these people. It's okay to engage in violence. It's okay to plan for an assault on the Capitol if you got my back. And so that was my concern about it. And while the pardoning power itself doesn't necessarily reflect a movement in an authoritarian direction, because as we talked about, this is clearly a power that presidents have. What I saw and what I see as the condoning of violence is one of those warning signs, that the authors of How Democracies Die warned about. Go ahead.
So I just want to be a little Socratic here. Let me be clear. What
Right.
you're saying is in the pardoning of what we're really talking about are those 69 people that assaulted police officers, right? The 300 people who were convicted of assault. We're talking about assault with a weapon. 69 people assaulted police officers with a what could be considered a dangerous weapon.
Right. 172 pled guilty
Pled
to
guilty
assault.
to
So we're
assault.
talking about
So
so it's not just the 69, it's a larger number.
here's the thing though. Assault is one of those fuzzy crimes because assault can either be an attack on somebody of physical harm or a threat of physical harm, right? So the guy who said grab his gun and shoot him, that guy would be found guilty of assault. But that to me is a different level of assault than somebody who's physically dragging a police officer down the steps, for instance, right?
But aren't both objectionable?
Of course, 100%.
Okay.
I don't know of anybody, certainly nobody on the right that is saying, yeah, protesters, yeah, January 6th, right? Nobody is saying that. But real quick, I want to be Socratic with what you said. You said that you see the pardoning of these bad actors, the especially bad actors, as a tacit approval of their behavior. And that's not something that I see reflected in anything that anybody has said. It's certainly not something that I think. I think that if a person assaults police officers, they need to go to jail. They need to pay the price for that. So this is something that we've talked about before, but my position on this is, I think, pretty close to what most people's position, center right, is, which is that I would have preferred to have seen a pardon of all the nonviolent offenders, and the people who actually committed violence against police, you go ahead and stay in jail, right? I think that would have been a better way to handle this issue. That Donald Trump came out and just blanket pardoned everybody. What that says to me is that he wants to put January 6th in the past, right? You could say he's given a little fu to the Democratic Party. Maybe that's, he feels that way. But he wants to put this in the past. I don't see this as something where he's like, okay, guys, I got your back, in the future when you're ready to do more violence, make sure. Because remember, these guys, if the message is if you commit violence in my name, I got your back, they still did time, right? They've still been in jail for years.
They would still be in jail for years if
And
he wasn't
they would, but
president.
they would
They are,
still,
let me
but
put it
they
this way,
have
they are not in jail because of him.
fair
So
enough.
I don't know how you can interpret the message any other way
What is
than,
the appropriate amount of jail time for a person who participates in a riot?
well,
Just on average.
as you know, when in cases like this, I am, and some of you may not be familiar with this, I'm sort of what we call an institutionalist. That is, I tend to defer to the institutions and the processes that they use, whether it's Congress, the bureaucracy, and the courts. So, what is the appropriate time? The appropriate time to me is what the courts decide, what the courts decide. And so
Mhm,
when you say that this was a fuck you to the Democrats, that to me fundamentally misrepresents what happened. These
mhm,
people were charged by the Department of Justice. They had to go ahead and go before a judge and a jury. They had to present evidence. They had all of the legal rights to present their defense. Many of them pled guilty. Many of them
mhm.
pled guilty. Um, and so to me, I'm okay with whatever the courts decide. And there are some people I believe who got shorter sentences because they expressed remorse at what they had participated in. Um, but and maybe this is where we'll disagree. It seems entirely obvious to me that the message that Donald Trump sent by doing this blanket pardon um, was violence in my name is okay.
Mhm.
And
So
and if I were one of them, if I got called to the Capitol again and he was still president, I would have every reason to believe that if something bad happened, he would have my back.
I understand, and I think maybe what you're doing is you're looking at the worst of the worst of the people who were involved in January 6th. I think while the people who were the worst of the worst maybe didn't get the sentence that they should have gotten, I think that reasonable people on both sides have acknowledged that there were a lot of people who got caught up in the net that were over prosecuted, right? That there were people who walked in and just kind of milled around and didn't really do anything bad, but they ended up with a sentence. So I think what people on the other side are saying is, look, some of these folks got a bad deal, they got a raw deal, they got over prosecuted. The FBI was very zealous in their prosecutions. Obviously, the FBI has a lot more resources than any individual does. And if they are under the gun to produce results, we want convictions on this on January 6th. It's very easy for people to get ground under the wheel in that kind of situation. So I think that the blanket pardon was an attempt to sort of restore some semblance of justice in that sense. The downside is I agree with you. I think the people who were the worst perpetrators of violence on that day did not pay the price that they should have. Um, that's so I don't agree with the outcome, but I don't think that it was quite as bad as you're making it out to be.
What
And
what,
where I'll put it. That's where I'll end it.
what do you mean not as bad? January
I
6th
don't
itself?
I don't think well January 6th itself we have some disagreement on whether it was a riot or not. You and I know that you don't think it was an insurrection, but there are plenty of people who do.
Right.
And I think that again, that's kind of an overzealous representation of what actually happened on that day. I think it was a riot. I think all riots are bad. I think people who commit violence against police officers should be thrown in jail for as long as you say, as the court says is appropriate. But I do think that there are a lot of people who were just kind of milling around that day, didn't really know what was happening, who ended
So
up getting
let's
scooped up.
let's dispense with those people. Whether say that sort of your statement, reasonable people can disagree. I think that that's completely fine.
Hmm.
That some of the sentences were too harsh. I don't know that, but I'm not sure I believe that because I think a lot of the people who were arrested who didn't engage in this kind of stuff didn't do a lot of time. It was in particular the people who engaged in violence. But the idea that it's a riot, that it was a riot, I think is just factually incorrect.
Hmm.
And Jubal and I have had this conversation a few times. Um, after January 6th happened, I heard a lot of people on my side of the aisle talking about how Trump had incited a riot. So what they were arguing was that he should be charged with crimes. One of the things he should be charged with was incitement. You're not allowed to incite violence, even though we have First Amendment protections. You're not allowed to incite violence. That's the Brandenburg ruling. Look it up, Brandenburg versus Ohio.
Hmm.
But I said from the very beginning, he's not going to be charged with incitement. If you look at the text of his speech, it doesn't come close to rising to the level of incitement. So this, to me, while there were riotous characteristics among some of the people, one of the other reasons that he was not going to be charged with incitement is that the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers were already attacking the building when Donald Trump was still on the stage. He couldn't possibly have incited them to do something. They had a detailed plan
Hmm.
for what they were going to do, and they came there and executed that plan, one attacking the east side of the Capitol, one
Sure.
attacking the west side of the Capitol. That's not a riot. That is an effort. And he didn't call them on January 5th, and he didn't call them on January 7th. He called them on January 6th because he knew what was going to be happening in Congress at the time. So to me, again, and these are one of those things where we'll just have to agree to disagree. The message to me, the message I think Stuart Rhodes gets, the message that all these people who were convicted of seditious conspiracy, the message they got was, if you go ahead and engage in violence on my behalf, I've got your back.
Hmm.
And I don't think, while he may have thought of it as a fuck you to the Democratic Party, to me, it was really a fuck you to the law enforcement officers. That's who it was
Well,
a real fuck you. So the question for me, as I look at this in the context of our bigger discussion, is that one of the things that the authors point out in How Democracy Dies is that one of the things that would be authoritarians do is they condone violence. He was calling them the January 6th hostages,
hmm.
right? He was referring to them as hostages the same way the people who were captured by Hamas in Israel were hostages. These people weren't hostages. And so I've already made that point. There's no point in going on. So I want to give Jubal the sort of the last word in terms of this question.
I think that our justice system, the spirit of our justice system is that it's better to let 10 guilty people go free than to imprison one innocent person. That is the guiding principle of the way the American justice system is put together. And I think that probably mathematically that's about what happened here, right? Like you had a whole bunch of people, or whatever it was, 69 people who were very, very bad actors who should be in prison. Um, they were released, and they were released in a blanket pardon because the consideration was the people who committed the lesser crimes, and making sure that they didn't have to pay a stiffer price than they should have. As I said, what it comes down to is we agree that a more thorough case by case analysis would have been more appropriate in this situation. I think that the push was to put January 6th in the past. I don't see the what you see in the sense of Trump sending a secret message to people that violence on his behalf is okay. Uh, because I don't
Why not?
because I don't hear what you say, that it was he was telling law enforcement, giving an FU to law enforcement. He's showed respect to law enforcement. People on the right generally show respect to law enforcement, and he gets the support of law enforcement. And so I don't think that resonates. But I understand if you see it as, and this is a major divide between the two sides too, is that people on the left tend to see January 6th as a much bigger deal than people on the right. Now, is it because it was Republicans that were there? I'm sure that's part of it, right? But for the same reason, I think that a lot of people on the left didn't see the George Floyd riots as that big a deal, and people on the right were really offended by those riots because the great majority of those people were Democrats that were out there doing that stuff. So
We have no idea what the party affiliation of the people who rioted are.
people,
You can speculate all you want. I'm just saying we don't have any information about whatsoever. Likewise, we don't know whether or not the people who were convicted
I,
for
I think it's a safe
attacks
bet to
on the
say,
Capitol, whether the people who attacked the Capitol were Republicans. Some of
I
them may have been independents. Some of them may have been
let's
other
say
things.
majorities.
They
Let's
were
say majorities then.
majority.
It's fine.
But
I have no problem.
here's the problem. I don't recall a single Democrat going ahead and condoning violence against police officers in in any of the George Floyd riots. I don't think they condoned the violence, and I know
Who condoned violence against police officers on the right? Who did that?
what Donald Trump. the
You're
leader of the party.
that's your interpretation.
When you go ahead and you let out people who attack police officers, you are condoning violence. You are telling them, I got your back. I called you here on the day to count the electoral ballots to try and prevent me from losing the White House, right? You did what I asked you to do. You went in. We know already that people in his administration, in his White House, had gone to him repeatedly saying, post something, tweet something, tell them to go home.
Mhm.
And he refused.
So
All the way
this is
through, his actions condoned violence. And again, this may be one of those things where people just have to agree to disagree. And to me, equating what I think could fairly be called spontaneous riots as a result of the George Floyd incident is very different than a planned,
there's no doubt
coordinated,
there's no doubt that they were
coordinated
different.
attack, coordinated attack designed to disrupt the counting of the electoral votes because Donald Trump couldn't accept the fact that he lost an election. So he attempted to overturn not the government, as people say. That's why I don't buy the insurrection argument. He didn't try and overturn statewide elections. He didn't try and overturn senatorial or House elections. He was interested in overturning one election. And he chose multiple paths to get that. And one of the paths was violence. One of the paths
So
was violence. And
I just want to
his failure
interject.
to act in the moment tells me that he had their backs.
Okay. I get it. I just want to interject that
Go ahead.
you're attributing now to Donald Trump an intention that is not corroborated, right? That you're saying he was the mastermind essentially of the January
No, no, no.
6th riots, that this was his intention for this riot to take place. And I don't think that that has been established in any meaningful way other than people interpreting it that way. So we have,
And just be clear, I will agree to you. I would agree that there is no concrete evidence linking him to the attack on the Capitol. What we can do, because what we're trying to discern is my argument has been he's condoning violence. So I'm saying, speaking to what I think of as his state of mind, well, what kind of things would lead somebody to conclude that somebody was condoning violence? Well, one way would be that when the violence is taking place, if people who are allied with Donald Trump are saying, please do something, his lawyer, his daughter are telling him, do something, tweet something, tell him to go home.
Mhm.
When he's informed that they're walking through the halls of Congress chanting, hang Mike Pence.
Mhm.
And what we know is that his chief of staff comes back and tells everybody he doesn't think they're doing anything wrong. His chief of
So
staff.
I understand. So this was a flashpoint. January 6th is a very sore point for a lot of people. There's a lot of different opinion on what happened and what the intentions were. But right now, what we have, what you and I have, is a difference in understanding Donald Trump's intentions. And that's something that we're never going to be able to prove. We're not going to be able to get inside Donald Trump's head and read his mind and say this is what his intentions were. We can't do that. So all we can do is move forward based on the facts. Now here's where we end up. Let's put a pin in this and let's move on to the next point. We're not
Okay.
going to agree on what Donald Trump's intentions were. But what we can agree on is that this the blanket pardoning was not handled in the best way possible. I think you and I are on the same page of that, at
Yeah.
least, right? That the people who really committed the crime should have paid a stiffer price. They didn't. And so that's unfortunate. You're reading that as a tacit approval of the violence that took place. I'm reading that as a protection of the people who got swept up and paid stiffer penalties than they should have. And that's really the major difference. So how does this relate now to authoritarianism? Can we say that the blanket pardoning of the people on January 6th, that is an expression of authoritarianism?
I don't know because you're pointing out that some of the people didn't engage in violence. Many of the people didn't engage in violence. They broke the law. Yeah, but I believe that there were people who sort of walked into the Capitol and trespassed, but n- those people I don't necessarily think
They
need
weren't
to
there to
be
wreck shop. Like they
right.
weren't there to
Exactly.
break stuff.
Right. Um, So how it gets back to our question of authoritarian versus like just the expansion of executive power. This has nothing to do with the expansion of executive power. We already know the pardoning power is plenary. That's in the Constitution. If you don't like that, amend the Constitution. So then the winds up being the message. If I understand you correctly, Jubal, and you know, I don't want to put words in your mouth. You're saying he freed the violent people because the nonviolent people were treated unfairly. Okay. And to me, the logic behind that is problematic. So well, I guess maybe to round it off, um, maybe just address my concern stemming from how democracies die, and that is that one of the patterns that they identify is the condoning of violence or an affiliation with people
Let's
who
let me
engage in violence. That why isn't the message to them why isn't the message? If you engage in violence on my behalf, I've got your back.
okay.
Specifically, those people.
So let me try it this way. If I was able to know Donald Trump's mind somehow, if there was a communication that he sent or an intention that he spoke to somebody where he's like, I want to make sure that these guys get off because you know, they should know that I'm going to protect them if they're going to do violence. If there was anything like that anywhere in the ether, then I could see your point. And if I was to know personally somehow what he was actually thinking, that he was actually thinking that he was going to protect these people, then I would be on your side. But the thing is, the way that I see it is, I can't know that. I can't know what his true intentions were, and so I can't judge him based on my opinion. Right? The only thing we can judge him on is the facts. Uh,
And that is what I'm doing. I think what I'm doing is I'm judging on facts. Some of these facts you're maybe less familiar with, like some of the information that was provided in the January 6th testimony. But to me, while I can't read his mind, we all go about our lives sort of watching how people act and making assumptions about
mhm.
the way what motivates them. And so for me, I don't know any of the people who were found guilty of attacking police officers, right? But to me, it seems clear. And I don't know how it wouldn't be. Like I don't know how it wouldn't be. The message wouldn't be if you go ahead and commit violence on my behalf, that's acceptable. I remember during the campaign, I think it was in the first campaign, there was some protester at a rally, and um, he was walking up the steps and flipping off all the Trump supporters, and this guy walked over and just fucking cold cocked him.
I
And
think I
Don,
remember that.
remember that?
And Donald Trump
And
said he was going to pay his legal bills.
yeah, and said his people
Right.
had been in touch with him. Is that's a small scale, right? Of one guy acting.
Right.
Um,
Did he do that? Did he pay his bills?
I don't know. I don't
Mm.
know. But if he did, is that tantamount to condoning violence?
I would say you know, maybe technically, but at the same time, I think that
I love
that's
you throw the word technically in that context.
yeah, I mean, you know, if you're saying I support
But
this
it's
person punching this other guy in the face, but also at the same time, Donald
but
Trump
what
is
does
he's a
what does the word
showman.
technically do?
He is trying to connect with the crowd in that situation and do something funny. Look, I I don't know that we want to dig up that can of worms, but let's just say this. You are taking the pardoning of the January 6th protesters as a condoning of the most violent. I am taking it as a protection of the least violent. Now, to me, that's a difference of opinion. It's going to be very, very difficult for us to come up with any kind of factual basis for why we both think that. Um, you're going to say that your judgment is sound. I'm going to say my judgment is sound, and we're going to come to a
But
disagreement.
I'm wondering, because you're talking about evidence. What I can provide is evidence of things that people who were in Donald Trump's orbit said
Hmm.
about how he responded during the time of the attack,
Hmm.
how he responded. That's stuff that was said under oath by
Hmm.
people who worked for Donald Trump, many of whom split with him after January 5th, after January 6th, right? So there's all kinds of factual evidence about his attitude towards the people who were attacking the Capitol building, right? On the flip side, what you have is this theory that in order to spare the people who didn't engage in violence, he pardoned everybody, including the people who did engage in violence.
Hmm.
Now, you're saying that you want factual information. Where is there any factual information to support that claim?
I think where that comes from is the people who were prosecuted, that have come out and talked about it and said that they felt that they were over prosecuted. There was a number of people who felt
No,
that way.
no, no,
The other,
I understand people felt that they were over prosecuted. You made a specific claim about what you thought. You're doing the same thing I'm trying to do. Think out and reason out why
right,
Donald Trump did the blanket pardon.
a hundred percent.
The argument you're making, if I understand it correctly, is that he thought some people were over prosecuted, and so he let everybody out, even the people who engaged in violence.
Hmm.
And what I'm asking is what evidence do you have that that was the calculation? These people were over prosecuted. Therefore, I'm going to let everybody out, including the people who clearly engaged in violence. Is there something
Maybe you're not understanding my point. My point is that neither one of us have any evidence. I'm not saying that I have evidence and you don't.
I disagree. I have evidence, things that were said in testimony under oath with
Hmm.
a penalty of perjury. That's
Okay.
what I have. I mean, you
And
can
and
accept it
which
as truthful or not
which of
truthful,
the
but
people who testified in January 6th, well, in the January 6th hearings, which of those people said that it was Donald Trump's intention to protect those who were committing violence for him?
what they said was that he didn't think that they were doing anything wrong,
Okay.
that he was sitting there watching the attack on the Capitol building, essentially the chief law enforcement officer of the United States, or at least the federal government. He was watching the attack in real time and for hours did nothing, despite repeated requests from people in his administration to, to just go on and
Hmm.
tweet something
I
saying go
I
home.
understand, but my question was, who
Those are the people who I'm relying on.
I
They're the
understand
ones
who
that's
said
testament.
of all the testimony that was given in the January 6th hearing, which person said Donald Trump's intention is to protect those who are committing violence on his behalf? I don't think anybody said
No,
that.
no, because that happened after the fact
Okay.
when he
So
pardoned them. We don't know.
so
We don't know what happened
we don't
after he
know.
pardoned.
That's basically what I'm getting to is neither one of us know. I'm not telling you that I have a claim to knowledge that you don't have. What I'm saying is neither one of us has an appropriate claim to knowledge to make a final judgment on this issue. Hang on. You just lost your audio. No. Hang on. All right, we got Phil's audio back. He was so upset that his mic went dead. So let's do this. We still got a couple things to talk about. Let's put a pin in this.
Okay.
Maybe at some later point we'll come back and we'll revisit the January 6th stuff. The way that I see it, and I'll give you the final word. The way that I see it is you and I have a difference of opinion on the intentions of Donald Trump. I'm not saying that I know his intentions. I'm saying that I don't know his intentions. And because I don't know his intentions, I can't make a judgment call on whether or not he should be held responsible for uh, 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 protecting people who are committing violence for him. You, however, seem to be saying that you do know his intentions, and you're basing that on the testimony of people at January 6th, but nobody said anything remotely close to that. I'm going to give you the last word. Go ahead.
Okay. And I think, and I would say, as I said before my I went mute. there was a there was a lot of testimony that made it clear that Donald Trump was not concerned about the violence that was taking place. And again, this wasn't said by Democrats. This wasn't said by Democrats. This was said by Republicans who were in the White House as the attack was taking place. And a lot of these people broke with him on January 6th. These are the people who testified. It wasn't Democrats who testified in the January 6th hearing. It was Republicans who had signed on with Donald Trump because they believed in him. And on that day, what they saw so bothered them that they broke from him completely. It's their testimony that I'm relying on, their evidence, what they saw on that day, and then what he subsequently did later on that fit with their description. They said he was okay with the violence. He pardoned the most violent of them, which suggests, again, he was okay with the violence. But we'll just move on from there.
That's all right.
Um,
So what we've got
right.
is we've spent a good deal of time on January 6th talking about that. We've talked around it. There are a couple other things on January 6th we want to get to. I think what we do is we do in the next episode, we're going to be talking about the the firing of DOJ employees that were involved in January 6th prosecutions, the conversation the administration is having about that, the inspectors general, and then maybe we'll get into the executive orders that seem to be challenging constitutional principles. So for now, I think that at the end of this, that we haven't come to a satisfactory conclusion of whether or not January 6th was actually an expression of authoritarianism or not. If Phil is right, and if you agree with Phil, that Donald Trump's intentions in the pardon were to protect the people who committed violence on his behalf, then I think you're justified in seeing it as an expression of authoritarianism, right? I think that's fair. And for my part, if you see it like I do, where he was trying to put this in the past, went about it in a clumsy way, maybe was too concerned with people who had been over prosecuted and less concerned with people who really did deserve to be in jail. Um, so if you kind of see it from that direction, maybe it's not the expression of authoritarianism that some might think it is. I'm going to give you the last word, Phil, and then we'll get out of here.
One of the things that sort of I want to touch on, and it's periodic, we're going to undoubtedly return to this, is as you can see, Jubal and I see this thing very differently, right? But we can talk about it, we can disagree, we can lay out our positions, and move on to other things. And so we've said this in previous videos. If there's a subtext to all of this, it's the idea that the people you disagree with, even the people you disagree with strongly, aren't necessarily your enemy. And more importantly, that staying engaged and talking to people, even if you don't come to an agreement, like Jubal and I didn't come to an agreement on this. Even if we don't come to an agreement, one is that we did come to some sort of agreement, right? That perhaps this wasn't the best way to do it. Probably should have been done on a case by case basis,
Hmm.
right?
We
Something
do
like
we
that,
do we do agree on that.
right? That finding that common ground, it's like a building block for further conversations,
Hmm.
right? Because it's not like I think Jubal like is condoning violence. I don't think that. Do I think that about Donald Trump? I do, but not Jubal. And we share that value. We share that common value. And so I hope that in your conversations with people, sometimes it can be difficult to talk to people you disagree with, but I would encourage you to stay engaged, no matter which side of the aisle you're on. Um, Stay engaged and continue to have these conversations. These are important, complicated times.
That's right. Hard conversations make the country better.
100%.
And with that, we will see you next time. Thanks for joining us. Take care.